All right, gang, another CB vlog here. We're going to get right to the big topic of today. What's that topic, Sean?
How fast is your deck? We're going to talk about speeds, fast versus slow, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so how fast does your deck... It's not necessarily like how fast does your deck run, because your deck doesn't have legs and it can't enter into races and things like that. It's mostly...
we also don't mean how fast does your deck achieve its win condition.
True, exactly.
That's also not what we're talking either.
That's a real thing that we're not talking about.
I guess we're just going to tackle this idea in a couple of groups. So I guess the simplest way to compare speeds of things are spells that are instants and or sorceries, right? Sorceries are quote unquote slow. Instants are fast. I mean, that's just how we think of things because they have the names imply that
Instant. It happens in an instant.
Right. And so like most of the draw spells you're going to run, you're going to want to run them at instant speed because that gives you more flexibility. You can make the decision at any point. But sometimes sorcery spells do give you a lot more options. Like I don't think any of the spells also color pie things, but cultivate will be a green staple forever. And I don't think they'll ever make an instant land tutor that I would want to run over cultivate unless it was strictly better somehow.
Yeah, like they do have one. It's a 3 mana instant speed, but it's just a rampant growth, right? So there you're willing to make that trade-off of the speed for the benefit of the card, for the effect, right?
Yeah, and I guess this is something as a brewer that you have to ask yourself, like, how important is it me to go instant speed? I think generally it's better. So, and I think that also is predicated more on how much you have to do at that speed. It's sort of like it kind of fuels itself. Like the more instant effects you have, the more instants you want. And that one sorcery holds back all your other instants. But if you had only sorceries, then it doesn't matter which one you cast. None of them are going to be affected in your hand. Your opponents don't necessarily know that, but from a player point of view. So, I mean, I don't think it's not super genius to say that instants are better than sorceries, but I guess the interesting discussion to me is what would you need to get from a sorcery in order to make you run that over an instant version? Because there's very few spells that you can't find an instant version of that maybe cost a little bit more.
Yeah, and so like I was saying for that that card, that's I can't remember the name of it right now. Do you? I'm not very good at searching.
Okay, I'll get on it. I'm a good searcher.
Yeah, you're better at it than I am.
Yeah.
The 3 mana rampant growth is not better than the 2 mana sorcery speed rampant growth, right? The 3 mana instant speed rampant growth. They're even in decks that want landfall, even at instant speed, like for example, like maybe like you've got an Omnath Locus of Rage deck or something. I still just think the sorcery speed one is going to be better than that, just because you want to hit that on turn 2, you want to ramp out on turn 2, or at least later in the game when you do get a benefit from it, you want it to be able to do more stuff with your turn. So I think there you're paying for that efficiency over the actual like speed of the spell, and I think it's basically always going to be worth it to just run rampant growth over that card, which is
Natural Connection.
There it is, Natural Connection. Yeah, that was from, I think, like Battle for Zendikar or something.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Now that we're on the cultivate / thing, there's a 3 mana instant called Harrow, and it puts 2 lands into basics untapped, but you have to sacrifice a land as part of the casting cost.
Yeah.
So you only end up going up 1 land, but because the 2 lands come in untapped, you sort of only have paid 1 for it, kind of?
Yeah, and you get 2 like land drop or like landfall triggers. So for a deck like, for example, Angry Omnath again, this card is fantastic. This card is better than anything than Cultivate or Kanama's Reach even, right?
Yeah. I mean, and so, yeah, so like this is the kind of thing you got to consider, right? Like, so once you start looking at the different things, it's like, yeah, I mean, depending on what your deck wants to do, you may want the sorcery version, for example, because it also has a proliferate option. If that's what you're into. Yeah.
So this is pretty simple, right? It's balancing out the extra mana that you pay for the instant speed ability and the benefit you'll get from the sorcery. And when does it pay off to make those trade-offs, essentially, right?
Yeah, and I think there's also a special case to be made for there are some sorcery spells that are just totally unique. That like this, there's only one spell that does this, and it's sorcery. Like there isn't an instant version. And we always imagine like one day, like what if they did an instant version? How much would that cost?
Yeah, exactly. Because you know it's going to cost more to be able to do that, because that is just like that's just basically better at any time.
You're paying for it.
Like if they made a 2-mana rampant growth that was instant, why not? It lets you leave mana open, like, and that's the benefit of an instant always, is lets you leave mana open so that your opponents are guessing at what you're going to do, and or at any point you'll be able to change your decision to do something that's the most relevant for the board at that time.
Yeah.
Simple stuff, really, honestly.
Simple stuff. So take a look at your decks as you're brewing them, right? Like I know we always default to like cultivate Kodama's Reach. There's a lot of defaults we do, but just have a look to see if there's an instant version of your sorceries that might do something similar, and then you can evaluate if it's worth the extra cost. Keeping in mind, too, the more instants you have, the more important it is to have more instants. But if you only have a few anyway, if you're just in colors that aren't running a lot of instants, then maybe it's not as important to you, and you can afford to go for the sorcery that has much more impact.
So this reminds me of when I was brewing, the first time I was ever brewing my Afara deck. So Afara is the god from Theros. I'm just plugging her in here.
Sure.
Afara, god of the polis. She's the 4-mana 6/5 that basically that says at the beginning of each upkeep, if you had another creature enter the battlefield under your control last turn, draw a card. So one great strategy with Afara is to flash creatures in on your opponent's turns so that your next opponent's turn, you'll draw a card. So you want to be able to maximize the draw that you're getting on those upkeeps. So each of your opponent's upkeeps, hopefully you'll be drawing something. I found that when I was like, okay, great. I'm going to make like flash tribal, basically. I'm going to have all these creatures with flash. We'll have lots of instants and stuff like that. So we'll be playing this whole deck at instant speed. And that is the way that that this deck plays when I built it. But I found that what you're saying right now, it's like, it's not a parasitical, is that a word? Yeah. It's not a parasitic. There it is. You don't need that extra "ul" at the end of that. It's not a parasitic mechanic like energy. Like the more energy cards you want to have, the more you need to have to support it. Like it like eats up spots in your deck. But with Afara, it's like I had all these flash creatures, so then it's just I could put a bunch of sorceries in too. I could, but it's better for me to include now a bunch of like counter spells and instant speed things. So like I had, instead of say putting in like a 6-mana Wrath, I put in the 5-mana Wrath route that you can pay 2 extra to make it an instant now. So all of a sudden I'm playing that at instant speed, and then it really paved the way to put a bunch of counter spells in this deck, because you're holding up all your mana all the time. So why not run the removal that also partners with that, right? So this deck ended up turning into a like real permission style deck for a while, and then actually only recently did I take out a bunch of counter spells, because I was like, no, the deck is all counter spells, and I didn't. That's not necessarily what I wanted it to be. I wanted more flash creatures, so it's kind of morphing back into leaning towards creatures and flash spells.
I'm glad you bring up flash spells too, because it's like that's like creatures with flash. It's not just instants and sorceries. Like flash creatures are sort of the instant version of sorcery creatures. There aren't a ton of flash creatures in this game. Like, there's not a lot of creatures that do have flash, and most of them, what colors are they? Like, a lot of blue, a lot of white, and, like, obviously Snapcaster Mage is flash, and that's incredible, and it's also a creature, but it's, like, sort of more like a spell.
Yeah.
But, like, don't forget about things like Aven Mind Sensor. That's that flash flyer that if an opponent would search a library, that player only searches for the top 4 cards of the library instead. So it's a great way to kind of counter all these Harrows and Cultivates we're talking about.
Yeah.
And a card like that has to be flash, because it usually brings in an effect that you want to surprise while something's on the stack.
Yeah, exactly. And like I was saying, like the more flash creatures, the more other thing. Like it might not, like even Mindsets are such a narrow card. It comes in at a very specific time. So sometimes you'll have a go around the table if you're holding up your Avid Mind Sensor and there won't be an opportunity to use it. So obviously you want other instant speed things to do in case this is not relevant at the time. Counter spells are the thing that I think make the most sense because it's removal, right? So
yeah. Cool.
Great.
So another way we can compare like how fast or slow your deck is just by the CMC of your spells. We sort of alluded to this idea talking about instants and sorceries. You can usually get an instant version, but you have to up the CMC by 1 or 2. A great thing to think about this is spells that wrath the board, like like Wrath of God classically cost 4 mana, white 2. But there's numerous other spells in white in particular that do the same thing, maybe with a little bit of more upside, but that cost 5 or that cost 6. Or as you mentioned, Route costs 5 basically, or 7 if you want to cast it at instant speed.
Yeah.
So
Fumigate gives you a bunch of life, but it costs 5.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, a lot of these extra bonuses don't necessarily add a lot of utility. Like, what's the big deal about that extra life? Like, maybe there's a token player you gain like 50 life from them, but like generally speaking, if people have sack outlets, they will sack their creatures before the Fumigate actually resolves, and you won't gain any life from it, right? So it's not often a big difference. So you might ask yourself, why not always run Wrath of God? It's like, well, then this comes down to actual real world pricing. Like, Wrath of God probably costs a little bit more than Fumigate, although I've not double checked because Fumigate is in standard right now.
I can confirm that Fumigate is definitely cheaper.
Yeah, Wrath of God is like on average $8 depending on which edition you get. Yeah, so I mean, and that's what you pay for. So like now it becomes a question of like, well, do I want to pay real money? How important is it to me to be 1 mana faster? Is it worth the extra $4, right, in real life?
And there is something to be said for, so what we're talking about here is like, deck speed, right? So is your deck, this is now the other thing that we were talking about too. Like, this factors in the actual speed of your win con or whatever, because being able to play a Wrath of God on turn 6 and then follow it up with something that costs 2 mana is valuable, right? Like, that's something that's the ideal situation, right? Or obviously a bit later and play something even bigger. But you trade that off a bit when you play the 6 mana Wraths or the 5 mana Wraths. But specifically speaking, the 5 mana Wraths and 4 mana Wraths, to me, in Commander, certainly in our meta, and I would probably say in most games I've ever played, there's no real difference. There's basically no difference. It is so rare that you want to Wrath on turn 4 that 1 mana basically never matters.
Yeah.
If you're in a super fast meta now, for example, and people are running aggro decks like crazy, or they're comboing off, right away, then yes, of course, by all means, play Wrath of God, play Bontu's Reckoning, get that 3 mana Wrath going, if you need it. But yeah. I think on average in Commander, and the type of Commander games that Sean and I find ourselves in, that 1 mana difference, that speed difference is not a big difference. And the rest of our deck, I think in general, the way we brew decks, will support that 5 mana Wrath, because things are just going to be a little bit slower in general, so you're okay to take that time. And it kind of counts on that, right?
Yeah, like, and there's a philosophical approach of like this is a game that we're playing, but I'm going to spend my real life money, right? Yeah. And so I spend a lot more of my life spending real life money on other things than I do playing games of Commander where my commander is white.
Yeah.
And has like white in the color identity. So to me, my to oversimplify things, my quality of life is better when my commander decks are a little bit slower and I have an extra $4, to get the extra guacamole on my Chipotle later, right?
Listen, it comes down to, do you want guac or not?
Right?
Get Fumigate and get that guac. If you want me to get Wrath of God, you're skipping on the guac.
You're skipping guac. And then what's more important for your life? If you just if you're playing your games of Commander, it's like, oh man, I only want to do it if I can get everything on turn 4, turn 5, and the game's over by turn 6. It's like, you know what? More power to you. I'm going to be here eating my Chipotle.
I'm going to be getting that extra sauce. You know what I mean?
Yeah, man. Extra sauces all day.
Yeah, extra sauces all day. Extra toppings on pizza. We're talking about like buying not the grocery store brand of bread. Like you can get the national brand. Yeah, all these little things that you can do now.
Oh man, yeah, you don't have to get your cereal from the bulk store.
Fill up your Tupperware containers. You know, you can get actual just boxes.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, we are making light of it in a little bit, but like, yeah, like honestly, from game to game, a lot of these 1 mana differences add up to statistical differences that only show up over hundreds and hundreds of games.
Yeah.
And like, you know, when we meet to play Commander, we play 2 or 3 games. Like I would have to play the same deck for years to notice that percentage difference of Wrath of God versus Fumigate. Of course, I'm going to be able to say a time where I'm like, you know what, I did Wrath of God and I couldn't have afforded it if it was Fumigate. It's like, yeah, I'm sure that's going to happen. But like, not much.
Yeah, and it's true. Like, it is true that there is an actual cost there, and yes, one is more efficient than the other. It's just a matter of how important is that in your meta, in your deck, all that sort of thing. And I think overall you'll find that it isn't as important as like $4. At least we've deemed it not to be. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, I was sort of transitioning to the next one. If you want to talk more on CMC.
No, that's what I was going to do too.
Yeah. So like, this also ties into the kinds of lands that we use, right? You're going to pay a real life premium for lands that always come into play untapped versus lands that come into play tapped. And that is how decks get faster. If you can play the maximum CMC every turn because your lands all come into play untapped, that's a faster move than if you have to like play 1 mana less because one of your lands is tapped as it enters the battlefield. But they've given us a wealth of super cheap, like if we're willing to forego that speed. A lot of people ask us, how do we do mana bases so cheap? How do we do decks so cheap? The way we do decks so cheap is our mana bases are super cheap. We generally don't include shocks and fetches. And it's just like when I brew decks, I mean, Andy's style is a little bit different than mine, but when I brew decks, I just hit, I want 3 types of dual lands for every color pair within the combinations of my color identity. I want a command tower, and if I'm 3 or more colors, I'll probably run a Rupture Spire, but I know Andy feels differently about that one.
I was going to talk about it, so good.
Let's do it.
Good thing you mentioned it.
Yes.
So we'll do like Guild Gates, bounce lands, gain lands, right? Those are themes that we like to stick with, the life gain lands and so on. I think those are pretty much auto includes for us, although like a lot of people won't run Guild Gates and things like that because they're going to pay the premium to get those shocks and those fetches.
Yeah.
And I think that oddly enough, actually, if you're running more expensive Wraths and other things like that, you actually want those untapped lands more, which is kind of funny because it's like you're going to be making up some ground by having the lands come in untapped on time, whereas if you run the tapped lands and the 4 CMCs, is kind of that also kind of evens out too, right? So it's interesting how those things will work out that way. But if you have untapped lands of 4 CMC Wraths, obviously you're super fast. But the way we generally do it is like 5 CMC and tap lands. So we're really talking about like sometimes 6 mana Wrath or 5 mana Wrath on turn 6. But really, generally speaking, you're going to run those Wraths way later anyway, so it doesn't even matter. That's been my experience in Commander all the years I've been playing. And yeah, let's talk about Rupture Spire and Transguild Promenades. This is something that we've talked about on the show before, but I don't think we've ever gone into a real deep dive about it. So Transguild Promenade and Rupture Spire are the same card, basically. They both enter the battlefield tapped, their lands. When it enters the battlefield, you have to sacrifice it unless you pay 1 colorless, and then you can tap it to add mana of any color. So I stopped including these cards in my decks. My 3-color decks, they're out. I don't think I ever ran these in 2-color decks, but three colors, they're out for me all the way. 4-color, I'm still very cagey about including them. And 5-color, I think it's like you can make a decent argument for it. And I think it's probably fine. But this is more than just a tap land, right? This is a higher cost, and like I know we've been talking about this, like 1 mana difference isn't that much, but this is not that. This is actually a 2 mana difference. So this is your Transguild Promenade has to come in and then tap another land with it. So as it comes in, so this actually sets you back like a whole turn, kind of. So I stopped running these because I would find myself getting this card on like turn 7 or 8 or even after, and wanting to go, okay, I want to activate this ability from this creature that I have, and I want to cast this thing that's in my hand. All I need is an untapped land. And then I would draw this, and I'm like, well, now I can't do either of the things, let's say, because I've got to play this land. So then I would find myself not doing that. I wouldn't even play the land. I would do one of the things I wanted to do, let's say, and then hold this land and just hope for an untapped land sometimes. Not every time, obviously, but yeah, like if it's a dire situation, you need to do something. Sometimes you can't even play this land. So that happened to me a couple times, and I found that in general, some of the other lands that they were reprinting became cheaper. Like I want to say Exotic Orchard, but is that the one? The one that taps for colors that your opponents have?
Exotic Orchard.
Yes,
yeah.
Exotic Orchard came down in price when they reprinted it in the Commander set, and I was like, okay, great. That was a thing that like solidified getting rid of this card. And yeah, some other ones too. So that's an example of real life price affecting it, as well as I think like the cost was just too high. When you get this thing on turn 2, it's fantastic. It's great. Whatever, you tap your 1 extra land, it's fine. But otherwise, it always sets you back a turn, and sometimes, especially late in the game when things are all happening and you need to make a move, or someone's going to go off, or someone's going to kill you or something, it's too high a cost, and sometimes just becomes a dead card. Yeah,
and so I want to bring up the the panoramas. There's 5 panoramas. Which one are you pulling up, Andy?
I'm going to pull up Grixis Panorama.
So the Grixis Panorama, they all are sort of in the Shards of Alara days, so they refer to shards. So only 5 of the 3 color combinations. The Grixis one obviously does islands, swamps, or mountains, but they come into play untapped and they tap for colorless. So these lands never hold you back by any amount of mana. They don't help your colors. So if you are a 3-color deck, this doesn't get you a double blue or a double black, for example. But as long as your mana demands are not super high, these lands will let you get a mana right now. And if you need some fixing, and if you have some mana open at the end of a turn, you can sacrifice them and tutor up a basic and put it into the battlefield tapped as a mana sink ability, which is a very useful thing to have in any deck. And these cards are like under a gumball. They're half a gumball a piece. At least the Grixis one is.
Yeah,
I haven't looked at all of them.
Yeah, these guys are way better just because they actually do tap for mana the turn they come into play, which can make the difference, right? I actually find myself in late in the game, you're way less likely to actually even crack this unless you've got like an extra mana lying around. Most times I just play this as an untapped land and just keep going. Like I don't even think about cracking it because at that point in the game, mana can be very important, and how you spend it can be very important in allocating it. So this at least gives you that flexibility, whereas Transguild Promenade and Rupture Spire, they don't do that.
And I would run these panoramas if I have 2 colors. Like if I was like, let's say Dimir, I would run a Grixis Panorama because it's a colorless land, and I can use it to get swamps or islands. The mountain part I just ignore.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable depending on what what your budget is like and that sort of thing. I think so.
Yeah. I mean, so I think a lot of what we're saying comes down to like, you're going to pay for speed with real life money, right? This is where the supply and demand is. The demand is to have faster decks, and that means the cost will be higher for the best cards of their types, always.
Yeah. I actually wanted to ask you, so why do you think it's worth running Rupture Spire and that sort of stuff in 3-color decks, whereas I don't? Like, what is it? Just the same thing? Like, you think that that trade-off that you make in efficiency just is like not that big a deal most of the time?
Yeah, that is what I feel. That's kind of the short answer of it. I feel like you've convinced me that in a 2-color deck, those cards are no good because there's numerous cards that can tap for 2 colors that are better than those, strictly better. So in a 2-color deck, that only ever gives you 2 colors of mana. In a 3-color deck, we get those. There are tri-lands. Khans of Tarkir finish the cycle, but there's a cycle from Shards of Alara. So you always have a tri-land. Your command tower probably is going to get all 3 colors. And that's one where getting 3 colors in one land is very good. But you know what? I think maybe I'm about to level up here. Maybe you've convinced me that I don't need him in 3 colors. Exotic Orchard is very cheap, so maybe that should replace a Rupture Spire.
And even the other Orchard, the one that gives someone a spirit, Forbidden Orchard?
Forbidden Orchard. Forbidden Orchard actually taps for any color of mana. And that one's up to $6.
Oh, that one's the expensive one, right?
Yeah.
Right. For some reason, I always link. Oh, I mean, because they're both orchards. Yeah, that card's like $6. So sure enough, you can probably. But still, like, that's not super expensive for a land. Like, if you have any of those, I'd use them over those, obviously. But yeah, those are a little more expensive, anyways.
Yeah.
But yeah, there you go. I mean, it is meta dependent, and it is the deck you're trying to build dependent. But if you're in like the same mindset as us, where we're going to brew knowing that, and I think generally people come to the table knowing that, like, that efficiency in Commander isn't as demanding as it is in every other format of Magic, then you're going to be able to A, save a lot of money, and B, just have easier access to, I think, most of these cards that you want and most of these effects that you want.
Yeah. Would you rather roll into Commander Night with just your decks, or roll into Commander Night with your decks and a sweet burrito with extra guac in it?
Get that guac. Anyways, this episode's been entitled "Get That Guac."
Yeah, get that guac with Commander's Brew.
All right, gang. Thanks for watching the vlog. We'll see you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Big thanks to all our patrons who make these episodes possible.
Yeah, and if you want to check out more comedy videos, check out our Brews News playlist.
Make sure you follow us on Twitch TV to see when we play live.
If you want to chat with us, head over to Twitter. We're at Commanders Brew.
And please hit subscribe to ding the bell and find out when we got new stuff coming out.
See you next time.
Bye.